All right. Good morning, everybody. I see we have people from near and far, and it's an international audience because there's at least one person from Canada who typed in. We might be even more international than that. I just want to apologize. My throat this morning just feels a little sore. I woke up with my voice is gone. And I have a mug of water here. I usually don't like to drink on Zoom, but if I get parched, I might have to. So I apologize in advance for that. We're going to look this morning at a few passages from Parashat Behar, which is the first of the two portions of this week's double portion. The title I put that you'll see on the source sheet or on your screen is a rabbinic expansion of ethical biblical principle. Do not wrong one another. And what we're going to look at today is a particular ethical principle and how it plays out in Jewish law in the Torah, and then what the rabbis do with it later. And I guess I gave away the end. There's a rabbinic expansion to this principle, and that will give us a little sense of the relationship between biblical Judaism and rabbinic Judaism, and one of the ways that the rabbis took what they were inherited in the Torah and shaped it for how they envisioned the world that they wanted to live in. That's what we're going to look at a little bit today. First, a little bit of background, and then we'll get to some text. I see also Julie's posted in the chat the source sheets. I will project them on the screen, but I know some people like to see them on their own or print them out. So you can see the link in the chat if you're interested in having your own copy. All right, so first, a little background. The Torah envisions the time when the Israelite people will settle in the land of Israel. And that process continues in the narrative story into the book of Joshua. And part of that vision is that the land of Israel is an inheritance to the Jewish people. What's interesting is it's not that the whole land of Israel is for the whole of the Jewish people, but the Bible describes territories. The land of Israel is divided up into different sections, and each tribe inherits a section. And then there are detailed lists in the book of Joshua where actually different family units are given subdivisions of their tribe section. So there's a notion from the Bible that it's not just that Israel is the land of the Jewish people, but specific plots of land are the land of specific families. And there's a notion that that is, that family's inheritance from God. And because it's an inheritance from God, there's a certain permanence to it. And that in part is what we see in the passage that we're going to look at from this week's portion. So I'm just now going to share my screen so you can see the text. Here we go. We're looking from near the beginning of the Parsha, at the end of the first and the beginning of the, beginning of the second Aliyah. The Torah is talking about the Jubilee year. A little more background on that. The Torah sees a 50-year cycle of years. You might be, just like we have 6 days of the week and then Shabbat, right, a seventh day of rest. The Bible envisions 6 days of work, 6 years of working the land, and a seventh year where the land rests, called the Shemitah year. And in the biblical numerology, since 7 is sort of a magic number, 7 times 7 is even more a magic number. And after you do a cycle of 7 sevens, you get a bonus year of rest. So the 50th year is a bonus year of rest, known as the Jubilee year. Here's what this week's Parsha says about that. The 50th year shall be a Jubilee for you. So it's a celebration. You shall not sow, right? You don't plant crops, neither shall you reap the aftergrowth or the harvest of the untrimmed vines. Right? It's a year where we refrain from agricultural work. And in fact, the 50th year, since it comes right after a sabbatical year, the 49th, there's this 2-year period of rest for the land. Verse 12 says, "For it is a Jubilee. It shall be holy to you, and you might only eat the growth direct from the field." So you're allowed to eat food that comes out of the ground on its own, but you're not allowed to actively plant or harvest crops in that year. And this is the key verse for us, 13. In this year of Jubilee, each of you shall return to his holding. And relating back to the background that I shared a minute ago, what this says is in the 50th year, there's sort of a reorganization of landholding that goes back to the original apportionment of land to family groups, right? The Bible recognizes that over the course of time, people might find themselves in a position where they have to sell their plot of land, or people might be interested in buying a plot of land to expand their farming, right? And there's a sense that for some reason or another, people might move and buy and sell land and trade with each other. But the Jubilee year is sort of a reset. In the Jubilee year, you go back to your original holding of land, and everyone sort of resettles with their tribe. And we return to that original division of land envisioned by the Bible as a gift of God or forever to particular families. Now, as an aside, we don't have any historical evidence of this ever happening, of every 50 years, people saying, okay, let's go, let's all go back home, and right, mass migrations of people back to where they started with their families 50 years before. But the Bible certainly envisions this system. And that leads us to the second text, a few verses later, that talks about the implications of this Jubilee year rule on the economy, especially in the moments when land is bought and sold as part of the normal course of events. And so this says the following: when you sell property to your neighbor or buy any from your neighbor, you shall not wrong one another. So the end is nice sentiment for the Torah. It's nice that Judaism says don't wrong one another. Feels like a good ethical principle. But this rule is planted in a very specific context. When you buy and sell land, you have to be fair in the transactional process. And here's why, and here's how it connects to the Jubilee year, the next two verses. In buying from your neighbor, you shall deduct only for the number of years since the Jubilee, and in selling to you, he shall charge you only for the remaining crop years. Right? The more such years, the higher the price you pay. The fewer such years, the lower the price you pay. For what he is selling you is a number of harvests. But these verses take into account this idea of every 50 years we go back to our original land, which makes the buying and selling of land not really a transaction of ownership forever, but in some ways a short-term rental. And what you're really selling is not the land itself, but the crops that will be harvested in each year from when you buy it or sell it till the end of the 50 years. So what does that mean? If you're at the beginning of a Jubilee cycle and you're selling land and you're going to sell it to someone for 49 years, you could charge a higher price than you could charge if you're selling in the 47th year and there are only 3 years left before you reset. So the economy, for buying and selling land has to do with how much use the buyer will get from that land before he has to give it back up and go back to his original plot. So it's a very different transactional system that we have, right? In the worlds in which we live today, the buying. Here, I'm gonna come back to you. Hang on, I'm gonna stop sharing my screen. In the world that we have today, right, the people can sell their property for as much as the buyers are willing to pay. Right. I don't know about what things are like where you are. I live in South Orange, New Jersey. It's right outside of New York City. In the last 18 months, as we've experienced the global pandemic, lots of people have decided, I don't want to live in the city anymore. I want my own backyard, I want my own house. It's a hard time to move to South Orange, New Jersey right now because the demand is higher than the supply and the home prices are going up. So it's a good time to sell, a bad time to buy. But there's no limit imposed on what price you could sell your house for, as long as you can find a buyer who's willing to pay the amount you want to charge, right? That's not the system that the Bible's laying out here for the exchange of property in the land of Israel. All right, I see as I've been talking, the chat has exploded with some questions, which is always great, but I'm behind on reading them. Oh, yes, Tanya says, very nice. This is sort of like well, there's a piece of it. If credit card companies write down your debt every year, in some ways that's true. There is a reset. It's not exactly the giving up of debt, but sometimes because people went into debt, that's what forced them to sell their land. And it was a restart. It was almost like, it's similar to the way bankruptcy lets people get a restart, but this is almost a resetting of the playing field. So over 50 years, people's fortunes go up and down, and your land holdings might go up and down, but every 50 years, we reset to where it was and go back to the beginning. Raymond has a great question. Levites, the tribe of Levi did not get land. The Levites lived interspersed amongst other people, and there were particular taxes that were levied to allow them to be supported. But that's not for our parsha. We might get to that some other week about the taxes that support the Levites. And Bruce asked about, is that why no one actually owns land in the state of Israel even today? I don't think that has biblical roots. I think some of the land rights in Israel today date back to the time when the Ottoman Empire was in charge of the land of Israel. And I think a lot of property laws in Israel are rooted in the rules of the Ottoman Empire, which I'm not an expert on this, but I think had to do with like the Sultan owned all the land. And people could sort of borrow it, but the owners were just sort of temporary residents because ultimately the empire owned the land. There we go. Ooh, is conquest a legitimate form of land acquisition? According to the Torah, that it is. In modern life, that's a big question, especially about the territories that Israel acquired in the 1967 war. But we're here for Parashat HaShavua, not politics. That is a great question, though. Okay. Last thing I'll respond to, Tanya asks about, is this connected to debt and slavery, right? Connected to the Yovel cycle are laws of the Shemitah year, right? The 7 years where if you have to sell yourself into slave, what the Torah does, other than because of Jewish slavery in Egypt as depicted in the Torah, the Torah doesn't work slavery into its reality. There's more a system of indentured servitude where the Torah recognizes that debt might force you to sell your labor to someone else for a period of time, but that also is limited. If you have a debt that you can't pay, and so you have to go work for the person to whom you owe money, the Torah sets up a system that every 7th year slaves, right, indentured servants are released. It's also a resetting. Also, maybe like that's more like the credit card company wiping out your debt, right? If you go into debt and you have to go work for somebody else, then every 7 years that resets. So there's sort of a global reset to individual debt every 7 years, and every 50 years land transfers go back, right? And what I want to pull out of this is that the price of transactions about land that gets set during a 50-year cycle is dependent not upon supply and demand, but dependent on where you are in the cycle and how many harvests are left. And the Torah says when you buy and sell the land, don't wrong your neighbor, meaning sell for a fair price based on how many years this person you're selling to will occupy the land. And that's the biblical principle. I want to shift for a moment to see what the rabbis do with it. Are we ready for that? I guess I see the questions have slowed down. One more question from Bruce. Does the Jubilee year follow the Shemitah year? That means 2 consecutive years of not sowing. Yes, Bruce, that is correct. The rabbis make some interesting statements about, the blessings, of good crops in the 48th year of the cycle will help you get through these 2 years. But if you don't believe in divine intervention in agriculture, the people have looked at this from the economic sense, say that if you're really going to not farm the land for 2 years, it would make for interesting times, which maybe the Jubilee, which is meant to be a celebration, might not be as much, as people might not have access to the same amount of crops. But the Biblical's vision is that, the Bible's vision is that for the 49th and the 50th year, those will be like sabbatical years without a normal harvest. Okay, so the rabbis see this, and they think about this notion you shouldn't wrong one another when you're buying and selling land, and they expand this principle. And we're going to look at one of a number of rabbinic texts, one from the Mishnah. There are a number of texts in the Mishnah that talk about this principle. This morning we're going to look at just one to get a start, where the rabbis sort of define how this notion that you shouldn't wrong one another in a financial transaction should apply not just towards land in the Yovel cycle, but should apply to every transaction. So let's take a look. Let me go back. I'm going to go back and share my screen. And we're moving down. If you're following in the text, this is if you printed out your own, we're on the third page. And the rabbis, here, I'm going to scroll up slowly on my screen so we read one section at a time, because we'll have to talk about it a little bit. So I read those biblical verses. I'm wondering, is there someone who's willing to read for us in the English the first little segment of this Mishnah? Julie, can you help me follow in the chat and pick someone if anyone is there?
Yes. Go ahead, Tanya.
Thank you.
Okay, the measure of fraud is for silver from the 24 silver in a selah, or 1/6 of the transaction.
All right, thank you, Tanya. When I'm teaching this Mishnah, I always love to stop here and say, see, get it? But it's a little more complicated than this, right? You have to know some background to follow this text. But the rabbis here are defining fraud. And I just want to highlight, I'll highlight it on the screen. In the Hebrew, the word for fraud is ona'ah. And this word shares the same root as, I'm going to scroll back a second, the same root that said, do not wrong one another. I'm highlighting the word in the biblical verse, right? It says, al tonu ish et achiv, right? Don't wrong one another. Because of the aleph in the verb, you don't see all the same letters in both places, but this verb, tonu, don't wrong one another, is the same root in Hebrew as the word ona'ah, which I've translated here as fraud. So the notion, right, that wronging someone in business transactions, right, makes for an unfair transaction. So when that unfair transaction takes place, right, the result of that is fraud. That's the linguistic connection. So what Tanya read for us, thanks Tanya, is a definition of the amount of fraud. What do the rabbis say? Fraud is 4 silver of the 24 silver of a selah, or 1/6 of the translation. In the rabbinic era, unfortunately, while they had various different coins, it didn't work so much on the decimal system like we did. So you would have like, we have $1, and then of the change for that, right? Dimes are 1/10 and quarters are 1/4. Here we have a system where the coin that's a selah is worth 24 silver pieces. That's the conversion rate, right? There's a silver coin that's worth 24 silver coins are worth 1 selah. And what the rabbis are saying here is the fraudulent amount that, the amount of money that makes a purchase fraudulent is 4 of 24, which here they do good reduction of fractions, which is 1/6. So what that means is the rabbis envisioned that when you're talking about fair transactions in the marketplace, that items have a value. And items have that value, and you're allowed to charge that value, and there could be some variance in the price. But if in the market you sell an item for more than, for 1/6 more than it's worth, meaning you sell it for more than 5/6 of its value, that's a fraudulent transaction. So that means if I'm selling something, if I'm selling here, I'll use my water mug. If I'm selling my water mug, it's my lovely Disney water, my souvenir from Disney World from a while back. If this mug is worth 24 silver pieces, and I sell it to you for more than 30, so if I sell it to you for 31 silver pieces, that's a fraudulent transaction. Why? Because the mug is worth 24. I've added 7 to the price, which is more than 1/6 of the original price, and that makes it a fraudulent transaction. And the rabbis, so here, in terms of thinking about this principle of not wronging one another in all transactions, not just in land transactions, the rabbis set the rate 1/6. So a merchant has up to 1/6 to upcharge on a product. And if they do, that's fine. But if they go past that 1/6, it's too much. It's considered fraudulent. And what happens as a result of that? Well, the buyer can return the project. Sorry, keep saying the wrong word today. The buyer can return the product. But the rabbis put one more stipulation on this, which is until when is it permitted for the buyer to return the item? Meaning, if you think you've been defrauded in your purchase, how long do you think, how long do you have to return what you bought and get your money back because you were overcharged? And the Mishnah starts by teaching a phrase that I will say from the outset is a little vague, but it will become clear as we go forward. But it's until when is it permitted to return the item? Until a period had passed that would allow you to show the merchandise to a merchant or to a relative. So I want us to ponder that for a minute. Keep that phrase in mind. How long do you have to return this item? The amount of time it would take to return, to show the merchandise to a merchant or a relative. Keep that in mind. And I want us to think about what that means. All right, I'm peeking back at yes, Bruce caught a math error I made. I said 5/6 of the value. Bruce, you're correct. I'm seeing in the chat. If you add 1/6 to the price, the maximum is 7/6 of the price. I think I said 5/6, which is bad math. Thank you, Bruce. I usually don't mess that up. And Joseph says, not bad that you can, your profit margin could be 17%. Right? The rabbis feel like that's fair, but past that is too much. All right, so you buy something and you think you've been defrauded. What do you think this logic is that you have the time it takes to show it to a merchant or a family member? Why would that be the amount? When I'm used to when there's a time limit on something, like if you go to Home Depot, they say you have 30 days to return this product. Right? We don't have a fraud, but well, we do have fraud laws in America, but most retailers say you can return anything for any reason, and they sometimes put a time limit, but that time limit is usually defined, right? 30 days, right? 60 days, sometimes 90 days. Sometimes in a global pandemic, those return deadlines are waived. But here they say you have the time until you can show it to a merchant, another merchant, or to a relative. What might that be about? Who thinks they see the logic in that? Wants to give a shot at explaining what the rabbis were after here? You can put in the chat you have an answer, or you can raise your hand digitally if you have that button in your Zoom.
Emily commented in the chat, you show it to your family and they say you paid too much.
Ah, good. This is, as a parent of teenagers, I think about that sometimes as my teenagers are a little more independent about making purchases. But Emily, what you said sometimes is the conversation we have in our house. My kids, at least now they're shopping online so they can ask us before they had purchased. But one of the things we evaluate is like, is this a fair price? Right. And I remember as a kid coming home, having bought something and my dad looking at me disapprovingly and said, you paid too much for that, kid. Right. Sometimes we buy something and we think we're getting a deal, but we've been overcharged. And when do we find out? When we come back home and a family member points it out. So Emily, that's part of the logic. Nice. Was it Emily? Sorry, Emily said something now. Might have the wrong name. I see another comment in the chat said, oh, you go to another merchant and they might have a different price. Right, and if you think about but it's true to us in the mall today, you go to the mall and you walk into one store and you see, a gray crew neck sweater that you really want and you think it's a good price and it's $50. And then you're at the next store, 2 stores down, and you see a very similar gray crew neck sweater and it's $35. And you're like, oh, I'm going to go return the $50 one because I'm going to take the $35 one. Right, the Rabbinic Marketplace kind of looked like that. There were buyers and sellers in the actual market, usually Mondays and Thursday mornings, which is, by the way, why Torah reading is Monday and Thursday morning, because that's when people got together in one place as opposed to being out on their farms. So while they were there in the market, you purchased something, and then you went to the next stall or 2 stalls down, and you saw the same item at a different price, and it made you think, oh, maybe I was overcharged. Tanya says, always check on Amazon. It's good. The rabbis didn't have Amazon, but it's good advice for today. Leslie makes a good point too. Sometimes people don't have the knowledge on their own about a price of an item. And they might have to, right? You might have to check to find out, right? Sometimes we buy something, we're not sure if it's a good deal. You need an expert to look at it. So you guys have a sense of this, right? The rabbi said, okay, here's the level of fraud, 7/6 of the price. Above that, it's fraudulent. And if you were defrauded, you have until you can show it to someone to check the price. And if after you consult, if you find out that the price was not a good one, you can go back and return the item and get your money back. Awesome. Now, it turns out, if you're familiar, I know this is a morning Torah class, but we're looking at a rabbinic text here. If you're familiar in this part, if you're familiar with the Mishnah, you'll know that sometimes the Mishnah brings more than one opinion about a particular topic. And that's true in this Mishnah also. And actually it gives us the other position in a story. A story, and in the story I see a glaring typo. My apologies. Rabbi Tarfon ruled in Lod. So Rabbi Tarfon is a rabbi in the Mishnah, and it happened that some of the time he was in Lod. If you have ever been to the airport in Israel, Ben Gurion Airport is in Lod. I don't know if the tarmac of the airport is right where the market was or where Rabbi Tarfon was standing. But if you've been to the airport in Israel, you've been to Lod. Of course, it looks very different now from what it looked like in the 2nd century. But Rabbi Tarfon in Lod, he taught the following. Fraud, again, excuse the typo. Fraud is a measure of 8 silver from the 24 silver. I left the Hebrew in for the silver. 24 silver of the selah, 1/3 of the transaction. So Rabbi Tarfon says the level of fraud is not 1/6. It's not 1/6. It's actually 1/3, and you can overcharge on 24, not 4 coins, but 8 coins. So it doubles the amount you're allowed to profit. How do you think the merchants are going to respond to this? That you can you can overcharge by 1/3 of the value of object instead of 1/6 of the value of the object? Well, if you're a merchant, like the merchants of Lod, you'd be very happy. Why? Because 1/3 is a bigger amount than 1/6. So now I have my $24 Disney mug, and instead of being able to sell it for $30 without it being fraud, I can now sell it 24 plus. Wait, yes, instead of plus. Sorry, I'm doing all the math wrong. 24, 1/6 of the 24 is 4. So I can add 4 to the 24 to 28 was the old price. And now I can add 8. So 32 is the new price that I can sell for without fraud. So based on Rabbi Tarfon, I can make a lot more money. And if I'm a merchant in Lod, I'm going to rejoice. But not so fast. Rabbi Tarfon has an opinion on the second item in the Mishnah as well. Rabbi Tarfon says, though, the time for returning an item is not until you show it to a friend or relative or merchant. The time for returning an item is an entire day. Now think in your head for a moment, is an entire day more or less than the time that you think would pass until you could show it to a merchant? If you have an idea, here we can take a chat poll. Is all day more or less than the time it would take to show it to the merchant? If you have an idea, you can type more or less into the chat. Let's see what we think. All right. Early voting is in, and the count is 1-1, one more, one less. Now we're getting some more or less. Someone said, it went by my screen too fast. I think I saw something about, it depends how easy it is to get to a merchant. Less time to review a higher amount, says Heidi. Heidi's tying the two questions together. Very nice. All right, we have a big crowd today. It's okay if you don't want to vote. Here's what the merchants of Lod said, and this is what can help us figure it out. The merchants of Lod said to Rabbi Tarfon, "Leave us as we were," and they reverted to the statement of the rabbis. So the merchant said, "Okay, Rabbi Tarfon, we were happy when you told us we could sell our mugs for $32 instead of $28, but you gave everybody the entire day to return it. We want to go back to the original purchase." And their logic will help us figure out what it is they're thinking. Since we know the merchants were happy with the higher price, what's the only way that would reverse their positive reception to Rabbi Tarfon? If he gave people a longer window to return the object. Meaning, Rabbi Tarfon allows them to charge more, but he has to give them more time. He's giving them more time to discover that the purchase was fraudulent, and the merchants don't want people to have more time, so they want to go back. They'd rather make a lower profit and restrict the time. Now, how do we know that? We have to think, it's hard to make it can be hard in this Mishnah to work out this logic just from the words of the text. And it's the reaction of the merchants of Lod, excuse me, that helps us spell it out this way. The merchants, of course, are going to want, we think, the higher price. And the Mishnah says they were happy when he said the higher price. Then it turns out with this return time, they're not happy anymore. We have to figure out how do we compare these two return times that aren't time-stamped themselves? And this uncovers maybe in actuality with the merchants and the merchants of Lod, something that's embedded into the system. From reading this Mishnah, I would posit that the merchants of Lod regularly are charging people fraudulent prices. And that's why they want to restrict the return time. They want to restrict the return time because once the return time is up, you can't return the object and the buyer is no longer protected from fraud. So how could it be that all day is longer than the time it takes to show it to a family member or a merchant, another merchant? Well, think about, this isn't, right, the rabbi's opinion that says you have until you show it to a merchant, it's not like take as long as you want. Right? Like I go shopping and I buy a mug and I come home and then I take a nap and I mow the lawn. And then, later in the day, I call my mom and show her the mug on Zoom and say, I pay a good price. And she tells me, and then I bring it back. There's an assumption in the rabbi's original position that you're going to do it quicker. I'm going to buy my mug. And then after I'm done with the transaction, I'm going to be in the next stall in the market in 5 minutes, and they'll check and bring it back, right? Or a modern image that fits this is, I never did this, so I don't know, but I'm told that if you go to buy a ring in the diamond market in Manhattan, right, you're buying an engagement ring and you're going to buy a stone, you can I don't know what you have to leave, some kind of deposit or your credit card or your ID or something, and you're allowed to take the stone you want to buy, and you can have it appraised at an appraiser, and there are appraisers in the diamond district in New York. So you go to the store, you get your diamond, you leave them a deposit, you go out, you have it appraised, and then you come right back, and if the appraisal matches the price the merchant wants to sell it for, you can buy it, and if you don't feel it's a fair price, you give it right back. I think the rabbis had in mind some version of this. As Emily's saying right now, that puts a responsibility on the buyer to check out a purchase relatively fast and then to bring it back relatively fast to correct it. And why are the merchants of Lod happy with a lower profit margin and the shorter time? I think because they think fewer people will have the time or take the time to meet that shorter, narrower deadline. And as a result of that, they can charge a fraudulent price and get away with it. Some of that brings me back to, the logic brings me back to what the Torah said, right? The Torah said, when we're buying and selling land, you have to think about how many crops the person who's getting the land from you is going to be able to harvest before they give it back to you. And that's what sets the price. And the rabbis are trying to impose on the economy through this Mishnah and their legislation, the notion that you should charge a fair price, and they want to put limits on it. They recognize that, there needs to be some system to check. They determine, the original position said fraud is above 1/4, but you have a long time to check it out. You have a short time to check it out. Rabbi Tarfon is willing to allow a higher price, but with that, he gives people more time to check it out. And the merchants preferred a lower legal limit for prices with a shorter time, potentially, right, based on this logic, because they're not charging the honorable price, because they're going to make not the 17% and not even maybe the 34% that Rabbi Tarfon lets them make, but maybe they're overcharging by 40%. And that upcharge, they're going to try to get away with. It does put the burden on the buyer to check it out quickly. The merchants, we see, aren't necessarily so ethical here, but that might be the point of why the rabbis are trying to legislate this. They're trying to legislate this notion that buying and selling has an ethical component. There's not, should not be a system of sell for whatever you want. If you go back to my real estate example, the rabbis would look at the housing market in my neighborhood in South Orange and say, it's not right to charge more for houses, in this age, just, because you can. There's a value to your house, right, which is sort of independent of supply and, maybe some independent of supply and demand, right? How rabbis interact with modern economic theory is hard to know. But it's not sell for whatever you want or sell for whatever you can get, but it's sell what's fair. I know that people who are buying in South Orange right now, I know some people feel like the prices just are out of whack with the value of the houses, and that's because we don't have this ethical limit. Okay, back to the title of my talk, and then we have a few minutes to see. There's some really interesting comments in the chat. I hope you guys are following them. There are a few are directly to me, so you can't see them. I'll have to see if I can share them. For me, this is a wonderful moment that depicts how the rabbis read the Torah at times. The Torah has a verse that's very specific to a very specific context. When you live in the land of Israel and you have to sell your land to someone not from your family or not from your tribe, you have to set the price fairly based on the number of years left in the Jubilee, because at the Jubilee, that's when everyone's going to give their land back, and the price of the land should fit the number of years that the people are going to borrow it or own it from you. The rabbis say underlying this is an ethical principle. And we're going to expand that. And we're going to use this to develop a whole system of ethics for the marketplace, because just as overcharging somebody for your land when they're not going to be able to use it for so long is unethical, so is overcharging someone for a mug or a gallon of milk or 5 pounds of rice or whatever's in the market. And they want to take the ethical principle that's in the Torah and expand it. And if we had more time, or if we were doing a course on business ethics on the rabbis, we would see it's these short passages that we read today in the Torah and a few others that lead to a very broad section of rabbinic law imposing an ethic of fairness on the marketplace to all kinds of situations not stated in the Torah. And this is a place where the rabbis see a little opening in the Torah to introduce an ethical notion into Jewish practice, and they take it and they build a whole system of ethics in transactional ethics and economic ethics that they saw as part of the world they wanted to see. And it's a way in which the rabbis really shaped Judaism and what it became. If we just went with the Torah, this notion of not wronging one another when we buy and sell would only apply to land transactions and only when the Jubilee was in existence. And we have, well, some people are still counting when the Jubilee is. We don't go back to our ancestral tribal lands as dictated in the book of Joshua, because I'm not sure which of those families is mine and which parcel of what part of Israel I'm entitled to. But if I follow rabbinic ethics, every transaction I make with everybody could be subject to this ethical principle that's behind this rule about land. The rabbis want to apply it everywhere. And it's an instance where they latch onto something important into how they think we should treat each other in the Bible and expand it to a whole world of human interactions in their effort to make the world a fairer place to live in. All right. Oh, my closing used up some of the question time. I see we're close to 11:15. I do appreciate everybody coming out on a Friday morning or very early morning for you West Coast people to study some Torah, and I hope you're taking away something that helps you understand both what's in this week's Parsha and how the rabbis read it.